The year is 1198. Inside the vaulted cathedral of Palermo, beneath candlelit arches and thick incense, a queen lies motionless in her gilded coffin. Her skin is pale, her breath imperceptible, declared dead by her attendants, mourned by a realm. But as the grave robbers approach by moonlight, their blades gleaming in the dark, they do not find silence. A scream pierces the night. Constance of Sicily, empress, mother of the future Frederick II, and once the most powerful woman in Christendom, was not dead at all. Buried alive, she awoke in her tomb, gasping against the crushing weight of stone and earth. Was it a mistake, a political betrayal, or a legend woven from fear? This is not just a tale of death, but of power, paranoia, and the price of being a woman crowned too soon. Before we descend further into this chilling tale of power, death, and whispered resurrection, make sure to subscribe for more dark histories from the shadows of the past. Like this video if stories like this leave you haunted, and drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing this global community of curious minds. Now, brace yourself. The legend of Constance of Sicily is just beginning. The marble floor of Palermo Cathedral glistened with candlelight as solemn monks recited prayers over the lifeless body of Constance of Sicily, empress, queen, and mother of an empire not yet born. Draped in imperial silk and sealed in a gilded coffin, she was lowered into the stone vault beneath the altar with the ceremonial gravity reserved for saints or monarchs. But the earth, it is said, did not keep its peace. As the final stone slab was placed and the mourners drifted away, a silence lingered, pregnant, charged. Then, sometime in the thick darkness of night, a hand emerged, not from the grave itself, but from the shadows of the cathedral, trembling with fear and greed. A thief, guided not by reverence but by rumor, crept toward the crypt, pried open the heavy cover with blood-rusted tools, and prepared to strip the corpse of its jewelry. But as his fingers closed around the empress's hand, he felt warmth, a shudder, a breath, then an unholy scream. The dead woman was not dead at all. She awoke beneath the weight of stone and incense, choking on the airlessness, her lungs clawing for breath, her eyes wide with the terror of premature burial. The thief staggered back, pale as the moonlight that now poured across the altar. Some say he fled. Others claim he died on the spot, heart-pierced by divine judgment. But what is certain is this: the tomb of Constance did not remain sealed. Whispers spread before dawn, whispers that a royal had returned from death, that the cathedral was cursed, that a queen's breath had been stolen and returned too soon. Physicians were summoned, priests consulted, but all offered different verdicts. Was it a mistake, a miracle, or a message? The church, anxious to suppress unrest, reasserted her death. The court, ever suspicious, remained divided. And yet, the people remembered. For centuries they spoke of the bride who had been buried alive, of the scream that echoed from beneath the stones, of the empress who rose not with glory, but with panic. Her tomb, though sealed again, no longer held certainty, only questions. How could the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean be pronounced dead, interred in splendor, and yet breathe again? What had gone wrong in the sacrosanct rituals of state death? What power had silenced her too soon, and who stood to gain from a queen's early disappearance? The tale would mutate through time, embroidered with blood and betrayal, but at its core lay a terrible image: a woman once cloaked in authority, now gasping for air beneath a monarch's crown. A body still warm, encased in sanctity, a scream no one wished to hear. This is where the story begins, not with a coronation or a triumph, but with a tomb that breathes, and a legend that refuses to die. In the year 1154, within the golden stone walls of Palermo's royal palace, a child was born into a house forged by conquest and cunning, the House of Hauteville, Norman rulers of Sicily, descended from mercenaries who had turned their swords into scepters. Her name was Constance, and from the moment of her birth, she was wrapped not in swaddling cloth but in prophecy and dread. A seer, it was whispered, foretold that her marriage would bring about the ruin of the kingdom, and so, as insurance against fate, she was hidden away, cloistered, not for devotion, but for containment. Behind convent walls she grew, not in faith but in silence, a royal womb sealed off from courtly ambition. For 3 decades she remained untouched, unseen, a spectral princess who walked gardens and muttered psalms while kingdoms changed hands outside her cell. Sicily, meanwhile, glistened like a gem in Europe's crown-rich, multicultural, and fiercely contested by popes, emperors, and noble houses alike. And then, in a single stroke, the silence broke. With the royal line faltering and no male heir secure, Constance, past 30, was summoned from obscurity and thrust into history. Her cousin, King William II, fearing a dynastic collapse, arranged her marriage to Henry of Hohenstaufen, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The convent's door opened, and out stepped not a withered spinster, as rumors claimed, but a tall, composed woman whose presence alone unnerved courtiers. Her betrothal in 1184 shocked the European stage. She was not merely marrying a man, she was joining two empires. With that union, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire began their uneasy dance of fusion that thrilled imperialists and terrified Sicilians. For the local barons, her marriage was treasonous. For the Pope, it was dangerous. For the German court, it was a trophy. And for Constance, it was an awakening. The Church reluctantly blessed the union but never trusted it. Clerics wrote in veiled tones of her intellect and composure, too sharp for their liking. To many, she became a paradox, a woman cloistered for piety now wielding imperial power, a bride too old to conceive now carrying the fate of a continent in her womb. Her age became an obsession. How could a woman so long untouched suddenly step into sovereignty? Was she still fertile? Was she a placeholder? Or worse, a legitimate heir who could reorder power not through marriage but through command? The court whispered, nobles plotted, and the world watched. What emerged from the convent was not a pawn, but a queen-in-waiting, one whose every breath now stirred geopolitical tremors. In an age where legitimacy was blood and blood was everything, Constance's reappearance was both a reckoning and a revolution. And so, the cloistered girl became a crowned woman, not through love or succession, but through necessity, fear, and a prophecy that still hung over her like a guillotine. When Constance of Sicily stood at the altar beside Henry of Hohenstaufen in the spring of 1186, the cathedral bells tolled not with celebration, but with calculation. She was a bride of 32 ancient by medieval standards, draped in imperial silks and crowned with gold, yet every eye in the pews saw not majesty, but mystery. In an era when girls were married off at 13 and grandmothers by 25, Constance's age was a scandal in itself. The court chroniclers recorded the union with stiff language and fewer blessings, while whispers festered in back chambers. Why had she waited? Why had she been hidden? And above all, could she bear an heir? From Paris to Palermo, from Mainz to Rome, the question of her womb overshadowed the wedding vows. Some called her barren, a dried rose pinned to a dying branch. Others suggested the marriage was a political rusea facade for German encroachment into southern Italy. Henry's court tolerated her as an exotic queen from the sun-drenched Isle, but they trusted her about as much as they trusted Sicilian spices not to mask poison. The papacy, meanwhile, watched with a theologian's paranoia. A woman of unproven fertility bearing the keys to two realms? That was no empress, that was a threat. In the political climate of the 12th century, a queen's body was not her own. It was a battlefield, a forge, a ledger of legitimacy. Every month she did not bleed. Every feast where she refused wine became a subject of scrutiny. Chroniclers noted the absence of announcements, of swelling stomachs, of christenings. The silence echoed across Europe, and in that silence bloomed suspicion. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed her womb had withered from years in the convent. A few, more conspiratorial, alleged she had birthed a child in secret deformed, demonic, or deadened. The court had covered it up. Satirical poems about the virgin empress began to circulate among German nobles, their verses sharp and laced with venom. Even Henry began to distance himself, focusing on imperial campaigns rather than nursery plans. And yet, Constance never publicly faltered. She bore the humiliation with chilling composure, neither confirming nor denying, moving through the courts like a figure carved in alabaster. But within her chambers, beneath the weight of expectation, time pressed like a vice. The irony was bitter. Here was a woman whose bloodline could unify kingdoms, yet whose body, by refusing to swell with child, threatened to unravel everything. The same hands that had lifted her veil now pointed toward her belly with accusation. In the minds of kings and cardinals, legitimacy was inseparable from reproduction, and Constance, brilliant, strategic, but childless, was a crowned question mark. And so she lingered, suspended in doubt, her throne a seat of thorns, her silence mistaken for sterility. What they could not see, or perhaps refused to believe, was that history was already stirring within her, and that the empress they mocked as barren would soon perform a spectacle that would leave Europe gasping. When the announcement came in the year 1193, it was met not with celebration but with suspicion. Constance, now nearly 40, declared herself pregnant. The court fell silent before erupting into murmurs. It was impossible, unbecoming, unbeheld. In a world where motherhood was expected in youth and dismissed by middle age, her claim shattered not only expectations but belief itself. Nobles scoffed, priests raised their brows, and even her husband, Emperor Henry VI, known more for ambition than warmth, reportedly viewed her swelling abdomen with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Whispers darkened every corridor, that the child was not his, that a surrogate had been bribed, that a peasant infant would be smuggled in and crowned as imperial heir. The Church, ever zealous to protect the purity of dynastic succession, hesitated to endorse the pregnancy, and in some corners of Christendom, bishops openly questioned whether a miracle had occurred or a fraud. Constance, aware that her age, her past seclusion, and her political importance had converged into a storm of doubt, chose not silence but defiance. What followed was a spectacle that no queen before or after would dare replicate. She ordered a procession through the cities of the realm, not cloaked in royal pomp, but stripped of its mystery. She rode in a litter, her garments carefully arranged to reveal the curvature of her belly, the unmistakable rise of life beneath her ribs. In market squares and cathedral steps, she stood with her hand upon her abdomen, allowing the people to see, to touch, to witness. Her body became a public archive, her womb a document signed in flesh. Chroniclers struggled to describe the scenes without descending into disbelief. Here was a queen stoic, grand, sovereign, parading herself like a relic of sainthood, not out of piety but out of political necessity. She was no longer simply a woman, she was evidence. Her fertility, long questioned, had become a battlefield, and she wielded it like a sword. In the southern towns of Sicily, where the heat baked the cobblestones and the scent of citrus mingled with incense, peasants wept at the sight, declaring it divine. In Rome, however, the spectacle was met with fury. Papal envoys condemned the public exposure as indecent, her display a violation of sacred modesty, but it was too late. The image had taken root. Constance, the ancient bride, the cloistered phantom, the crowned question mark, was undeniably pregnant. She had turned her body into propaganda, her condition into policy, and in doing so, inverted the balance of power. No longer the accused, she became the accuser, demanding belief, challenging patriarchy, exposing the fragility of a political order that required women to be fertile but invisible. And beneath the surface of her exposed skin, a future emperor stirred, not yet born, but already surrounded by doubt, prophecy, and the electric weight of expectation. Constance had given them their miracle, but in doing so, she had rewritten the terms of queenship itself. She was no longer simply a consort, she was a phenomenon. On a cold December morning in the year 1194, in the windswept town square of Jesi, a royal pavilion stood like an alien temple in the heart of the common world, its silken walls flapping in the winter gusts, its floor laid not with carpets or embroidered tapestries, but with bare stone slabs meant for butchers and cobblers, and upon those stones, Empress Constance of Sicily, wife to Henry VI, labored in agony. Not in the secrecy of palace chambers nor under the care of hidden midwives, but before a court of peasants, merchants, priests, and soldiers, summoned from the town and its surrounds, not to assist but to witness. Her screams tore through the morning air, each one not only a cry of pain but a declaration of political defiance. She had arranged the birth as spectacle, calculated in its rawness. The older mother, mocked and doubted, would expose her body once again not to show a belly, but to bring forth a crown. For hours she writhed upon the stone, her breath misting in the cold, her attendants hovering not with concern, but with careful glances toward the watching eyes beyond the draped openings of the pavilion. Chroniclers later noted the silence of the crowd, the stunned awe of a people who had never before seen an empress suffer so publicly, so intimately, so humanly. And then, just before midday, the cries of an infant broke through the air. A boy, alive, royal. The child was lifted by midwives and held aloft, bloodied and wailing, as officials read out his lineage to the assembled masses. He would be called Frederick of Hohenstaufen, Frederick of Sicily, Frederick of everything and everywhere that power could reach. His mother, pale and soaked in sweat, did not faint, did not collapse. She gazed into the cold sky as if daring heaven itself to contradict her. This was not birth, it was political theater, a sovereign ritual designed not to celebrate life, but to silence accusation. Her body had been a battleground. Now it was a temple of proof. For days afterward, witnesses were required to testify. Scribes drafted records, and messengers galloped across kingdoms bearing news of the miraculous, almost biblical birth. An empress who gave birth in public, on stone, surrounded by strangers. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Constance had turned her pain into evidence, her blood into law, her child into a weapon against doubt. Never again could it be said that Frederick was a changeling, a bastard, a German fraud. He had been born in the sight of God and the people, with stone as his cradle and the square as his cathedral. In doing so, Constance had burned her own privacy at the altar of legitimacy. The woman they once cloistered had now given birth to empire under the open sky. Her humiliation had become power, her pain the foundation of a dynasty. And the stone floor of Jesi would never be just a marketplace again. It would be remembered as the crucible where history cried its first breath. When Emperor Henry VI succumbed to fever in Messina in the autumn of 1197, the empire did not mourn it circled. Constance, now a widow of 43 and mother to a 3-year-old heir, found herself standing not behind the throne but before a precipice. Her husband's death, though expected by some, unleashed a storm of opportunism across Sicily and the broader Mediterranean world. German troops, once the backbone of the imperial presence in the south, remained in the kingdom like iron teeth without a head to guide them. Nobles loyal to the Hohenstaufen cause began maneuvering to seize towns, palaces, even the child Frederick himself. The Pope, ever watchful, sent envoys with velvet tongues and sharpened clauses, eager to reassert ecclesiastical claims over the island. But Constance did not flinch. She did not retreat into mourning. She did not beg for allies. Instead, she sharpened her rule like a blade. Her first act was brutal in its clarity. She renounced allegiance to the German Empire and declared Sicily a sovereign kingdom under her regency. She stripped German officials of their posts, arrested imperial captains, and expelled soldiers who dared defy her commands. German influence once her husband's shadow, and her son's inheritance was cast out like disease. She summoned Sicilian barons, not with gifts but with threats, and demanded their oaths anew. Those who hesitated found their lands seized or their sons taken as hostages. She reclaimed palaces, restructured the court, and replaced German advisors with local administrators who owed their rise to her alone. But the wolves did not scatter, they multiplied. Henry's brothers in the north eyed Sicily as their right, dispatching whispers and mercenaries to stir dissent. Papal agents arrived cloaked in sanctity, but their parchments dripped with political venom. In Palermo, rumors grew that the queen was a tyrant, that Frederick was not the true son of Henry, that Constance plotted to crown herself in her own name. Even among her allies, loyalty was a transaction thin, brittle, and bound to fear. At night, the corridors of her court echoed with footsteps too soft, silences too long. Her food was tasted thrice. Her letters were sealed with triple wax, and through it all, she remained a fortress of composure. Alone in a court of daggers, Constance governed not as a grieving widow but as a lioness defending her cub. She did not smile. She did not forget. And she did not forgive. Her son was too young to rule, too precious to risk, and she knew the vultures circled not just for her crown but for his blood. She held the kingdom in clenched fists, her knuckles white with resolve. In portraits from this era, her eyes are unreadable, her mouth unsmiling, her fingers always resting near the hilt of a sword or the parchment of a decree. Power, in her hands, had become a cloak of thorns. Constance of Sicily, hidden in a convent, once mocked as barren, now stood as the final wall between order and chaos. But walls, no matter how tall, are never beyond siege. The cathedral lay in breathless stillness, its arches blackened with soot from centuries of incense, its floor cool with the dew of Sicilian winter. Beneath that sacred stone, far from prayer and sunlight, lay the tomb of Constance of Sicily, sealed in haste, shrouded in linen, adorned in silence. But death, it seemed, had left the door ajar. One night, as legend insists, shadows spilled into the sanctuary, accompanied not by monks or mourners, but by men of filth and hunger. Grave robbers drawn by rumors of imperial gold, entombed with the quindescended with rusted crowbars, wax-dripped torches, and blades dulled by many sins. The stone was heavy, but not unyielding. With groans and sweat and curses, they pried it open and revealed what the world had not been allowed to see. A woman, regal even in decay, her face pale as milk, her fingers still curled, her lips parted ever so slightly, as though she had died mid-breath. Around her neck, rubies glistened like coagulated blood. On her fingers, rings of sapphire and jet caught the torchlight. One thief, emboldened, reached for her hand and began to saw at the flesh to free a stubborn band, and then her hand twitched. A rasping gasp escaped her throat. Her eyes flew open, white and wild, fixed on nothing and everything. A scream erupted, hoarse, jagged, ancient. Not the scream of a woman awakening gently, but of a soul wrenched back from the pit of earth. The torch dropped, the tomb filled with smoke and panic. One version of the tale says the thief collapsed on the spot, dead from terror, his face frozen in the rictus of guilt. Another claims he ran through the streets of Palermo babbling about the queen who would not die, before vanishing into madness. Yet a third, whispered in cloisters, speaks of a priest summoned in secret, who found the tomb ajar and the body twisted, its wrappings torn, the marble clawed by human hands. Whatever the truth, the tomb was sealed again, and this time more securely. Iron rods across the lid, holy water splashed in haste, a priest assigned to guard it by candlelight for 40 nights. But the damage had been done. Blood had been drawn where there should have been none. Breath had stirred in a place meant for stillness. And in every alley, every hearth, the tale spread, that Constance had been buried alive, that she had screamed in her grave, that death had hesitated before claiming her. The imagery took root like mold in the stone of a jeweled hand dripping blood, of regal lips gasping in darkness, of gold slick with sweat and panic. Palermo became a city of hushed tones and diverted eyes, and her tomb became not a monument, but a wound. For if even queens could wake in coffins, if even the anointed could be silenced while still alive, then what safety remained for anyone? The cathedral stood unchanged. But to those who passed by, it no longer whispered prayers, it exhaled warnings. In the dim corridors of historical scholarship, the story of Constance's death and her supposed return has split into 100 shadowed reflections, none quite touching the truth, all whispering in contradiction. Was it a cataleptic trance, a rare neurological state in which breath slows to invisibility, pulse softens to silence, and the body appears lifeless to the naked eye? Medieval medicine, with its fumbling fingers and reliance on holy water over heartbeat, had no tools to detect such conditions. Cases exist scattered in dusty chronicles of saints mistaken for dead, their coffins reopened days later to find fingernails clawed with panic, bodies twisted in post-mortem terror. Could Constance have been one of them, her royal blood offering no protection from the ignorance of her healers? Or was it something far darker, a murder wrapped in sanctity, a political execution smothered beneath incense? Her abrupt death, the unseemly haste of her burial, the absence of ceremony or empire, all point toward orchestration. The timing was too neat, her son's guardianship too quickly shifted into papal hands. Perhaps a cardinal's ring held poison. Perhaps a steward's wine concealed more than grief. Perhaps Henry's northern kin, threatened by her regency, found a dagger more elegant than steel, a burial without protest, a silence mistaken for peace. And what of the grave robbers? Was their intrusion mere greed, or was it arranged, a staged discovery to bury her twice, once in the ground and once in legend? Even modern scholars disagree. Some see the entire episode as allegory, a symbol of the suppression of female sovereignty in a world terrified of queens who ruled too well. Others point to letters, barely legible, suggesting that a court physician once protested her death certificate, only to disappear from the record. The Church, when asked centuries later, dismissed it all as fable, but it is the very lack of certainty that feeds the fire. For every plausible diagnosis, there is a motive wrapped in velvet and ink. Power does not tolerate ambiguity, and yet here lies one of history's most potent ambiguities. A queen buried in haste, rumored to have lived beyond her interment, and remembered not for the crown she wore, but for the breath she may have drawn after it was stripped away. Her body, never exhumed, remains beneath Palermo Cathedral, sealed in stone and prayer. But the questions buried with her have not been silenced. They echo in lecture halls and taverns, in the minds of skeptics and believers alike. Was it misfortune, medicine, or murder? A failure of pulsar, a triumph of plot? Perhaps the truth is as entombed as the queen herself. And perhaps that is the final, cruelest irony, that in her death, Constance achieved the one thing life had denied, a myth unkillable, a legacy not carved in marble but in doubt. For there is no grave deeper than history's refusal to choose a single truth. A ChatGPT est monta. In the candlelit kitchens of Naples, the vineyards of Apulia, and the crumbling convents of Calabria, the tale of the buried empress passed from lips to ink, from ink to firelit stories told in the hush between vespers and sleep. Whether it was truth wrapped in horror or fiction wrapped in bone, the story of Constance of Sicily entombed too soon, robbed and resurrected, silenced, then screaming became more than a rumor. It became a mirror. Across the generations, her name detached from dates and attached to meaning. She was no longer merely a historical queen, but an allegory for every woman whose voice had been muffled beneath velvet, whose breath had been mistaken for stillness, whose presence threatened power. In towns where noblewomen were married off like cattle and widows buried in cells of prayer, Constance's legend rang like a cracked bell, mournful, distorted, and loud. Artists painted her as pale and tearless, fingers reaching from beneath the stone, her crown askew, her lips open in protest. Poets gave her verses soaked in blood and gold. Some versions of the tale made her the victim of a jealous court, others a mother who chose death to protect her son, still others a saint punished for bearing too much truth in her womb. The factual threads of her reign, her late marriage, her miraculous birth, her lonely regency became embroidered with symbolic lace. Each detail no longer needed to be verified, it needed only to feel right. In the medieval imagination, her story sat beside those of martyred queens and cursed brides, fusing political paranoia with metaphysical dread. The image of a royal woman gasping beneath the stone became a metaphor for monarchy's brutality, for patriarchy's fear of fertile, ruling women, for the terrible fragility of power based on performance. To the literate elite, she became a warning of what happens when legitimacy is questioned too long. To the common people, she was a ghost who reminded them that even palaces could become tombs. And to women, especially those cloistered by walls or customs, she was a silent sister, clawing for breath beneath the weight of law, ritual, and silence. In cathedral sermons, priests warned of the dangers of pride and the finality of the grave, using her fate as a cautionary tale. In political tracts, her name was evoked to argue against female succession. In whispered prayers, she was remembered as a mother who endured every humiliation for her child. The legend was malleable, but always anchored in pain. Her body, whether it gasped once more in the tomb or never did at all, had been turned into a cipher, a vessel for collective anxieties about life, death, power, and the ease with which truth is buried. And so she remained, not as a chapter in a history book, but as a specter that walked between fact and fable, her breath forever caught in the stone throat of a legend that would not die. Frederick the Eye-Child of stone, born in spectacle, raised in suspicion, would grow to tower over the 13th century like a figure plucked from myth, a monarch who spoke 6 languages, studied the stars, corresponded with Muslim scholars, and dared to challenge the Pope himself. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and self-proclaimed heir to both Caesar and Solomon, he ruled not just through conquest, but through curiosity, creating laws in vernacular tongue and building a court where falconers and philosophers sat beside bishops. Yet behind the splendor of his Sicilian Renaissance, behind the marble colonnades and the mechanical marvels he commissioned, lay a silence that never fully lifted, the silence of his mother's tomb. Constance's ghost followed him not in chains, but in whispers. Her late marriage, her miraculous pregnancy, her public childbirth, and her eerie death were used as both validation and accusation. To some, they proved his destiny, a ruler born of divine orchestration. To others, they marked him as a usurper, a changeling whose legitimacy was forged in lies and spectacle. Enemies invoked his mother's legend to undermine him. If she had once tricked the world with a belly and a scream, could he not do the same with edicts and armies? Even allies, when pressed, could not explain away the circumstances of his birth without invoking miracles or conceding to myth. Papal propaganda painted him as the Antichrist, born of a sorceress queen, raised in the perfumed decadence of Palermo's harems. And still, Frederick endured. He wore his mother's legacy like a mantle ornate, heavy, impossible to remove. In moments of political theater, he evoked her name not with affection, but as an argument. Constance, Queen of Sicily, crowned by God, mother to emperors. Her memory became a tool, a scaffold upon which he built imperial grandeur. Yet he never reopened her tomb. He never staged a reburial, never erected a golden statue, never summoned the bards to sing of her. Perhaps because he could not. Perhaps because the mystery of her end was more useful unresolved. Or perhaps because some part of him feared what they might find beneath the marble lid-claw marks. Torn silk, a scream fossilized in stone. The cathedral in Palermo, where her body rests, became less a place of mourning and more a site of contested memory. Visitors came not to pray, but to wonder. Was she buried too soon? Did she awaken? Did she die for him? Or because of him? Even centuries later, when her name faded from the banners of dynasties, the image of her final breath or what might have followed, it remained etched in the imperial psyche. Frederick ruled as a man whose origins were always half-lit, part divine, part dreadful. And in that shadowed origin, in the echoes of his mother's story, lay the blueprint of his rule, bold, enigmatic, heretical, and haunted. For Constance had not merely given him life, she had given him legend. And legends, unlike tombs, are never sealed.